today. No, I'm going to fib.
Doctor, good morning. Could you state and spell your name for the record for us?
Michael Brannon, BRANNON.
Thank you. Counselor, you may inquire.
Dr. Brannon, good morning.
Good morning.
Wow.
Fry, having just traveled from Miami to Orlando.
Yes,
Is that not correct? Okay.
it was a good drive.
Would you please describe for the jury your background, training, and experience, both in forensic psychology as well as battered women syndrome?
Sure. So I'm a psychologist licensed in the state of Florida. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology. That's from a university called Nova University. I also have a master's degree in psychology. I received that in 1980, also in psychology. And I received my doctoral degree in psychology after a year internship where I worked with severely mentally ill individuals in Hialeah, Florida. In 1988, I finished my degree requirements for my doctorate in psychology.
Well, at least you don't have to go through the whole 9 hours. You only have to go through like the hour and fast forward that little bit.
Originally, I started off doing the work that most people kind of think about when they think about psychologists, doing therapy, counseling with people, helping them through with their problems, things like that. In 1994, I began on a career almost quite accidentally as a forensic psychologist, and I testified in my first case in front of a jury. And from that time on, I've been doing mostly forensic psychology. My practice very quickly changed from that time on. I'm currently the co-director of the Institute for Behavioral Sciences and the Law, and anywhere between 80 and 90% of all my work now is related to some legal or court-related matter in the ways in which mental health interfaces or impacts or helps to give opinions about various legal issues. I've taught rather extensively in the area of forensic psychology. I teach to mostly legal audiences, but oftentimes too, I speak to groups of psychology students wanting to sit up here and do what I'm doing as well. I'll make long drives and then come up here and talk to people about cases. I also currently on the staff, the adjunct faculty staff for the School of Psychiatry at Florida Atlantic University. I help to train their forensic psychiatrists, so not just psychologists, but psychiatrists in terms of doing this work as a psychologist or as a psychiatrist, a mental health professional who gives opinions in the courtroom.
And are you also required to update your educational background and knowledge as a forensic psychologist?
Yes, sir. So sure. So every 2 years, we're required to get 40 continuing education credits to maintain our license. And part of that is we have to, on a regular basis, update our work in domestic violence or battered women syndrome. So we have to take those courses. We're all required, whether you're a forensic psychologist or not, to take that coursework. So as part of our requirements, we also have to take separate coursework in regards to domestic violence as a general term, or intimate partner violence. But along with that comes discussion as well with battered spouse, or what's oftentimes called battered person syndrome now.
And I apologize. I'm kind of bouncing around here, Doctor. I apologize again. For the uninitiated, just exactly what do you mean by forensic psychology?
So forensic psychology is a division of psychology. Most people don't think about that as often when they think about psychologists. But forensic psychologists are individuals who have degrees in psychology who are working to help to answer questions that come up in the legal system. It could be in criminal cases like we're here for today, answering various criminal questions, giving opinions about those questions. Or it could be in other settings like family settings, divorce proceedings, or sometimes civil settings like personal injury. Someone's claiming some emotional damage or something has happened to them. So forensic psychology is really the way that we use the science of psychology to help give opinions about various legal matters.
Now, what is the DSM or the DSM-5?
The Bible.
The DSM it stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's kind of our code book, if you will, to help us to know what the different symptoms are for different mental health disorders, whether it's major depression or schizophrenia or anxiety. So it gives us a code book of here's the criteria you have to meet in order to have that diagnosis. And then we're able to utilize that in terms of either treatment, so even insurance billing, but being able to inform patients too about what condition we think that they're suffering from. It's been updated many times over the years. It started at just DSM, and now it's at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition, text revised. So we've gone through a lot of revisions over the years to kind of fine tune in an empirical or scientific way what the elements are, if you will, of various mental health conditions.
Now, you've been asked to testify today in regards to battered women's syndrome. Is the battered women's syndrome identified or located within the DSM-5?
So it is not. It is not a diagnostic category in
No.
the DSM-5 or other coding books as well. There's others besides the DSM. That's just the most popular one. But it's not a formal diagnosis that it is contained within that book, that classification manual that I just told you about.
And that's why she needs the PTSD or
However, is there
and
a
or depression.
subcategory that is located within the DSM-5 that experts would recognize as a DSM diagnosis?
Yes, sir.
And what is that, sir?
So that category would be in the trauma section of the DSM-5 TR. There's a whole category on trauma disorders, and it's most closely related to something that we call post-traumatic stress disorder. That isn't the only trauma disorder, but that's the one that what used to call battered women's syndrome. Now I refer to it as battered person syndrome, but all of it really is more connected to a trauma disorder like post-traumatic stress disorder.
Now, testify that you testify on criminal matters. Do you also testify? You indicated also on personal injury cases and emotional. That would be civil, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. In your experience, you've testified as an expert, as a forensic psychologist. Have you testified for, and today you're testifying for the defense or were called by the defense. Do you also testify for the state of Florida or other states within this country?
Yes to both of those. I've testified in other states, but I also testify for both the prosecution, the state or government, depending if it's federal or if it's a state case, and also for the defense. So I really get appointments and hired by both sides.
About how many times have you testified?
Wow. At last count, it was about 1,500 times. It's over that, way over that now. That was from a few years ago. I testify in a lot of different kinds of hearings and trials over the course of mostly in Florida, but in other states as well.
Now, you're familiar with the fact that there is a special jury instruction that's been recognized by the Florida Supreme Court.
Approach.
Lord. Oh Lord, won't you buy me a diamond ring? He must be stuck. Missed that one. No, got that one. Got that one. Did the judge ever find out about the outfit? No, I don't know. He must have, surely. He must have. I think when it came time, when they did that zipper demonstration, Elizabeth, did you see the James Owens actually make a point of stating that the paperclip that was on the zipper handle had come loose, and then they had a sidebar. So I'm tipping maybe it was mentioned then, but there's not been any mention of it. And it was we only knew about it
Objection
because
sustained.
there was someone in the courtroom that checked in with recovery addict during the lunch break and told us about it because it was off the camera.
Testified as to battered women's syndrome, battered person syndrome. Are there other synonyms or similar names for what you're describing, in particular battered spouse syndrome?
Intimate
Well,
partner.
we talk about it in terms of trauma disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder, but the way when it's applied to the legal system, it's called battered wife, or that was the original terminology for it, battered wife syndrome or battered person syndrome. So really depends on your setting. So in this setting, we oftentimes talk about this particular condition that I've been
Bless you.
I've been asked to talk about today,
every time.
is really referred to as battered spouse syndrome.
And have you been asked to give your opinion as a legal expert and on battered spouse syndrome?
Yes, sir.
How frequently have you been asked to do that?
I've been involved in about 100 cases of just that alone. I've been involved in some sort of testimony about 50 times.
And you indicated that you testified for the state. You testified for the defense. You testified in state cases, federal cases, could you break down on a percentage basis?
He's not here yet. He's working, I think, sweetheart.
Testifying for the defense.
It's really close in terms of last time we looked at it, it was about 50-50. On most cases, like for instance, if there's a case that involves battered spouse, potentially battered spouse or battered wife syndrome, I'm usually called by the defense first because they raise the issue. If you're called by the prosecution, whether it be federal or state, what oftentimes happens is it's in response to a defense expert that's been called. So do I agree or disagree with that other expert? So I'm usually, the call usually comes first from the defense, but in terms of who I'm hired by, it's pretty even. It's about 50-50.
Now, this time, Your Honor, I'm
50-50.
calling the witness as an expert in the field of forensic psychology.
Yes, approach.
The state's just going to keep doing this because they know if they know the importance of this diagnosis. So there's going to be every objection possible, I reckon.
Objection is sustained. Wait.
Come back. Hold up.
Objection is still sustained. Mr. Beck, you may continue.
So how accurate was I on my prediction, Teresia? On how this would play out?
Has battered spouse syndrome been accepted?
Yes, sir.
Sustained.
Can you describe the classic system or systemology wherein an individual might necessarily suffer and then exhibit symptoms of battered women syndrome?
Yes. So battered spouse syndrome is a woman, usually a woman's response. Doesn't have to be, but that's a classic historical research went into how women respond in situations in which there's intimate partner violence when they've been the victim of violence. Now we know, of course, in other kinds of relationships, men can be a victim of it as well, or whether it's a heterosexual or homosexual relationship, that both men and women can be victims. But we still know the majority of those individuals that are diagnosed with that condition or given that condition, classified with that condition, are women. We do know that it's a reaction, a strategy that's developed by the person who's being abused to someone who's abusing them in an intimate partner situation. And essentially what they're doing is they've made a determination that they can't effectively escape from the abuse. They can't just leave for some reason. They feel in danger or they've been threatened if they leave that something bad will happen to them. So it's a cognitive or thinking strategy on the part of the person being abused that I have to develop some coping skills or ways of protecting myself or maybe even loved ones as well from some form of imminent violence or danger or lethality. Something bad will happen to me if I don't develop a way of handling this abuse, this constant abuse that's coming towards me. So the battered wife syndrome is really a way of thinking. It's a psychological change that happens with a victim in terms of the way they cope and strategize to stay safe for themselves and other loved ones as well, oftentimes.
I'm going to ask a really silly question, if I may, Doctor. I don't know if you've noticed a bruise across the bridge of my nose this morning.
I did see that when I come in. Yes, sir.
Okay. This weekend,
Oh my God.
hypothetically, if an individual was digging around in the garbage, the lid fell down and cut his nose, the bridge of his nose wide open, would you as a forensic psychologist anticipate, or a psychologist in general, anticipate that there might be a physical or a psychological reaction or response to that degree of trauma?
So I don't know if it would be trauma or not. It could be, depending on the degree of the injury. And
That happened to me, actually. I got a cut on the top of my nose and a massive bruise, and it hurt like hell. But it was from the lid of the washing machine falling down and hitting me on the nose. So shit like that can happen.
Pain and things like that. But certainly you'd view that garbage can differently as you approached it. So it changes your psychology or the way that you look at that particular situation or that particular object. So by viewing it differently, you may engage in different behaviors. You may approach it differently. You may have somebody else approach it. You may approach it with both hands up. So it changes your behavior and your thinking about that garbage can.
Does that also apply to interpersonal relationships?
So it certainly can. No two people always react the same way to every situation. Trauma, one person's trauma is not a trauma to another person. But for people who do develop battered spouse syndrome, they do begin to change the way they view the person who's abusing them and what they have to do in order to maintain either their life or their safety, their physical safety in terms of their behavior and interactions with that person.
Now, is there a specific set of criteria that a psychologist, forensic psychologist, would necessarily rely upon in attempting to make a diagnosis or an assessment?
They overlap a lot.
Yes, sir.
And what are those criteria?
Well, you'd want to see one, if some type of abuse has occurred. That abuse can be physical, it can be sexual, it can be emotional, or it can just be the threat of abuse or bad things that's going to happen.
Financial.
There has to be something bad that's happened or that's threatened to be happening over a period of time. So abuse has to be present in order for this to be underway. Without abuse, there's no battered wife syndrome. But that's not enough. There also has to be what's called coercive control. Coercive control is really keeping the person's social interactions, overseen on a regular basis, controlling money, controlling preferences, even
Wanting
TV
to be with them all the
social
time.
media, looking at social media that the person is accessing or looking at, who they're talking to on Facebook, who they're texting. So it's a combination of abuse and coercive control that results in a person feeling victimized, but that's still not enough. That person then has to feel like they can't escape from that. They've either been told, if you leave me, you're going to die, or a family member is going to be harmed, your children, your mother, whatever it might be. And as a result of that, they develop strategies to cope with that, acquiescing, pleasing, doing anything they're asked to do, demeaning them.
Making steak dinners and all sorts of, making sure that they play puzzles and bits and pieces,
Themselves, allowing themselves to be controlled. All of the things that would fend off, if you will, some abuse or attack or threat to them or someone who surrounds them. So those would be the components that you would need to have, and that dance continues to go on usually repeatedly throughout the course of that relationship.
So I think what you're describing is
a cycle.
a subjective nature to the syndrome that's being described.
It's both objective and subjective. So objective in terms of the facts, like what's really happening. A person's being abused, they're being told certain things, there's control over them. But then a subjective part is the person's interpretation of that, their perception of that. So there's really both going on, and they have to kind of work together in order for this syndrome to be formalized and properly diagnosed.
You indicated that there's sometimes maybe some defense mechanisms that are, or strategies that are devised by the battered individual, the abused individual.
Yes, sir.
In your experience and your training, do controlled substances, alcohol, drugs frequently appear in your analysis or assessment?
Yes. And the way they appear is they can appear either from the abuser or the abused or both. What can happen from the abuser standpoint is they may only be abusive, or the abuse may become worse if they abuse substances. From the abused standpoint, it may be self-medication. It may be a way of coping with the anxiety that there's going to be something bad that potentially could happen to them or somebody else. It's kind of a way of dealing with walking on the eggshells.
I'm psychic.
So if I use substances, that can deaden the pain, if you will, for me, or help me to forget about it. So it's oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes part of either the abuser's behavior or the abused behavior.
Do they, in your
He's gonna get off.
do they, on occasion, actually defend the individual that is abusing them?
That's a very frequent part of this syndrome. Not always, but it's very frequent. It's why interviewing them becomes difficult sometimes, because they're used to explaining away their behavior, the abuser's behavior, my black eye, my missing tooth, his screaming and yelling in the background while I'm talking to mom on the phone.
See, testimony like this gives her interrogation video, more credibility as to why she lied. Like, you know what I mean? It explains to the jury the possibility that that might be the reason behind that testament, those statements. Yeah.
So they're used to making excuses for it. It's part of the coping strategy, trying to explain away this behavior. He's had a bad day. She's, really upset about something else that's going on. She's really never liked this at any other time. So defending that person is oftentimes a part of the battered spouse syndrome, and getting the person who's been abused to get them to stop defending them so they can talk about the actual abuse becomes a challenge.
Now, the DSM makes reference on occasion to rule outs, I assume for the diagnosis that's being applied. What is a rule out?
A rule out in our parlance says that we should consider these things before we look at other diagnoses. So, for instance, if we're going to consider schizophrenia, we should rule out substance abuse first, because oftentimes some drugs can create hallucinations and delusions and psychotic symptoms. So there's always rule outs, just like there are for medical conditions. So look for this before you consider this, is really what a rule out is.
Are there specific rule outs for battered women syndrome or PTSD?
Sure. So there's rule outs for everything, because you're considering a number of different conditions before you make a differential diagnosis, or you pick that's the one that I think best fits this person. So yes, there's rule outs for both of those.
For my sake, what is a differential diagnosis?
That's how you decide which one. It's whether it's your medical doctor, your psychologist, whoever. It's how they pick the right diagnosis. So you're going through kind of a card catalog in your head, and you're saying, all right, there's symptoms of this, but that's also consistent with symptoms of that. So is it schizophrenia? Is it bipolar disorder? Now I have to ask more questions. It's a decision tree. And that decision tree helps you to inform the person and either make a diagnosis in a legal setting or help to treat them clinically.
Now, if the individual, the psychologist who's doing the evaluation, identifies the presence of certain rule outs, what is their response professionally to those rule outs in establishing or assessing the patient?
You have to go down a decision tree. We all kind of do decision trees in our mind every day about what we should do or shouldn't do in certain situations. It happens automatically. It's more structured when you're doing it professionally. So if you have a concern about substances, then you would kind of take that track and you'd have to ask a lot of questions in that area. So you'd want to know what kind of substances, how often are they using those substances, what kind of effect have those substances had on them before. I just picked one of many possible rule outs there. But every one of them you'd have to explore or ask additional questions, because of course you don't want to come up with a wrong diagnosis, because in a legal setting that leads you to a bad opinion. In a clinical setting, it leads to bad treatment.
Now, I want to go back just a second. We talked about the subjective nature of the abused individual's understanding of what's happening. Does this subjective or does the experience that they have suffered result in, on occasion, their experiencing or their anticipating or assuming or imagining a threat that others may not?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
My God. I don't know why I'm still typing because I can talk. He is very, very easy to understand, clear and concise, credible, and likable psychologist. So I think he'll go down well with the jury. Does anyone know if Sarah is on antidepressants or what her medications are? I know she's on some, but like some medications, but I don't know what. Where will I be able to find that? I'm sure he'll probably mention what she's taking. Yeah. Sidebar. Where did Tricia go? Poof! She disappeared as well.
Objection is sustained.
Doctor, from what you described this morning, I think we're talking about a complex and sophisticated process for assessing and diagnosing PTSD, battered women, the matters that you described. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir.
And in this instance, this particular matter regarding the state versus Sarah Boone, were you approached about the possibility of doing an assessment as to Sarah Boone?
Approach.
Oh. What does it say in here about? Yeah, we went over yesterday that it's a cycle. So physical, sexual, and psychological abuse happen in cycles. Tension building, then the outburst of the violence, followed by the makeup. You know, the apologizing and promising to be better, and the cycle starts again. Involves coercive control, which the partner needs to know where they are at all times. Which she testified to. So the signs of domestic abuse can happen slowly. I put down here or there an odd excuse to keep you away from friends and family. Often ramps up once you've been isolated, and then you feel trapped. It's not always obvious. Domestic abuse is about controlling someone's mind and emotions as much as it is hurting their body. Being abused can leave you scarred and confused. It can be hard for you to see your partner's actions for what they really are. That's true. That's right. This went into using this as a defense. So the expert testimony concerning domestic violence can be offered for various purposes. 1, to show the defendant is a battered woman. 2, to explain the battered woman's state of mind. 3, to generally support the claim if they are a victim. 4, to explain the conduct. 5, to explain, God, I can't read, a battered, the validity of a defendant and their conduct. To explain a battered woman's recantation or resilience to prosecution.
Practice in regards to the assessment proceedings, the assessment efforts.
Well, I'd first want to know what type of an assessment that it is, because there's different methods of approach that you'd use to analyze and be able to give an opinion on whatever question's being asked of you. So the very first goal for me as a forensic psychologist is to isolate what the question is. So what are they asking me to do? Because I want to know, A, can I do that? Am I qualified to do that, or should I refer that to somebody else? Or B, is that something I'm going to have enough time to do and enough resources to do? The next thing I would do is start asking questions about specifically what you already have or what can you get to help me answer this question. So right away, I'd start to find out what's available. As forensic psychologists, we're supposed to do comprehensive evaluations of whatever the legal issue or question is, and it's supposed to rely on multiple sources of information. So depending again upon the question, I'm trying to then define early on what are those multiple pieces of information I'm going to need to help to try to give an opinion and an educated opinion about that matter.
Have you done an assessment in this particular case?
No, sir.
Oh,
Can you tell us very briefly whether that was your decision? Objection, relevance? Okay, that's fine, that's fine. I can move on.
Objection sustained.
I
In
can
your
help.
experience, doctor,
Thank you very much.
can battered women syndrome,
So he's just
rear
there
its
for his
ugly head?
opinion.
For instance, when there are threats to other members of the family, two-legged or four?
So yes, that's very common, that it's not just the person. It increases the terror from someone who's doing the abuse to mention other family members that they might also suffer abuse. So whether it's emotional or physical, those type of things are very common. Not always, but it's very common in the course of domestic violence cases or intimate partner violence cases.
And that fear that's developed by the abused individual may exist contemporaneously with other issues, alcoholism, schizophrenia, and the like. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. They can all be combined together. And certainly that increases if there's other family members that are threatened or live in the same home or close by. That can increase the terror. The purpose of that is to increase control, to make sure the abuser has more control over the person who's being abused.
1 second, Your Honor.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to know if two partners in the same relationship can both be battered spouse, can both suffer from battered spouse syndrome.
In doing an assessment, doctor, do you look at outside materials?
Yes, sir, always.
And what kind of outside materials do you necessarily review in order to make this assessment?
Specifically to battered woman syndrome?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So specific to this, you'd want to look at a lot of different sources of information because you're trying to, make a diagnosis if there's a trauma-related disorder, but you're also trying to figure out if there's the other elements necessary to make the diagnosis as well, like
History of
abuse that's been
abuse.
chronic over a period of time, and that the person feels they can't leave that situation, and if other people have been threatened. So you'd want to know things like not only what the facts are of the particular incident, usually some crime that's been committed, but you'd want to know the history of those behaviors. Has anyone else seen those? Are there people you can talk to? You know, friends, neighbors, bosses, anybody who's seen or heard of this abuse before? Have there been medical visits where the person has actually been damaged and shown up, made some other excuse, they slipped or fell or whatever it might be? You'd want to do psychological testing as a forensic psychologist.
That's where we're at now.
Very good tests that help us to determine whether someone's suffering from a trauma-based disorder or not. You'd want to know if the person who'd been accused of the crime for this type of evaluation made any statements to the police. If they did, you'd want to hear that statement. Or has there been a 911 call or calls? If that's happened, you'd want to hear that too. So any evidence you could collect, and these are some of those questions I was talking to you about before, you'd want to ask the person who's trying to hire you in the beginning, well, tell me what you have, because you'd want to see whether or not you're going to be able to make this analysis or not. So it's not good enough just to talk to the person, because that's just one form of information. It's almost like being a behavioral detective, if you will, as a forensic psychologist, because we're trying to get as much evidence wrapping around our interview with the person as possible to be able to guide our questions, but inform us and see whether there's what we call convergent validity. It's a fancy way of saying, does everything agree with each other? Does everything connect in a way that it all sort of makes sense? Or are these strange conflicting pieces of evidence that we need to explain away, or it just doesn't fit the criteria? So it's a rather comprehensive and complex evaluation that has to be conducted to come up with this. And the final piece I'd say about it is that because oftentimes the abused person is defending still the person that they've oftentimes committed a crime against, it takes a bit of time to get to where you need to go. with all victims of trauma, whether you're talking about situations where you're doing therapy or you're doing an analysis in this type of setting, a criminal setting, it usually takes some time to break through that and get them to trust you to talk about the trauma, but to stop defending the person and talk.
There's the excuse for the police interrogation. It was a day or two after. It explains away why she lied. Slate wiped clean. She's ticked all those boxes. She just needs now this psychiatrist to diagnose it. And I reckon they can't get a second degree. They can't. There's no way. If she gets a diagnosis from a psychiatrist, there's no way she'll get a second degree conviction. She may not even get involuntary manslaughter. They actually can, in some cases, even drop it back to prosecutorial misconduct, where she should never have been charged in the first place because of this syndrome. Yep.
Talk about the abuse and how they felt about the abuse. Your goal, if you will, is to be able to see what's happening in that situation through the abused person's eyes. If you look at it through your eyes, often it doesn't seem to make sense. But if you look at it through their eyes, if it meets the criteria for a battered spouse, then you can better understand their world and what they're dealing with.
And real briefly, some of the things that you are evaluating when you examine, particularly the individual themselves, you're looking for anxiety and or fear.
Yes.
Low self-esteem.
Yes.
Are you looking for depression?
Yes.
Are you looking for any form of social or interpersonal withdrawal?
Withdrawal, especially if it's forced withdrawal, controlled withdrawal, if there's consequences, socializing with my family, my friends, calling them on the phone, texting them. So especially in that context.
Stockholm syndrome.
Sure, that can be part of it.
And what is Stockholm syndrome, real briefly?
So it's really adapting to someone who's captive or taking over a person, controlling their life, sort of adapting to that situation. The famous model of that would be many, many decades ago, a woman called Patty Hearst, who was kidnapped. But it's taking on the beliefs and taking on an acceptance, if you will, of a kind of a captive situation. And in these situations with women who have been abused, who meet the criteria for battered spouse syndrome, they oftentimes adapt, defend, and take on in an acquiescent way that this is okay and I'm part of this situation, as opposed to opposed to the situation.
I can help them.
This syndrome exhibit itself in physical attributes.
It can, at times, even physical illness at times.
Inability to sleep, inability to keep food down, and those type of things.
Sure. Yes, sir.
Would that individual potentially experience hypervigilance?
Well, that's a large part of it. Of any trauma-based disorder is hypervigilance. What changes when you've been traumatized, any kind of trauma, not just abuse, but what changes is your perception of danger. So whether it's the lid of the garbage can hitting on your nose, or whether it's someone being abusive towards you, those situations change your perception of danger. So you no longer see that object or that person in the same way. You have a foreboding sense of danger could occur. So other people may not perceive it with that person. He's so nice at work, or he's nice in these other settings, or he's so great on the softball field, but at home he's different. So that person who's being abused, their perception changes.
Does that include denial?
It could include denial, and oftentimes that's part of the explanation. The defensiveness of that person is the denial of how bad things are.
That then negates the depraved mind component of second degree
That are going on.
and intent and willful disregard.
Any cross-examination?
Yes, sir. Morning, doctor.
Good morning.
Nice to see you in person.
Good to see you again.
So there's a subjective component to trauma. is what I understand you're saying, correct?
Always. Yes, sir.
And so hypothetically, a couple could be in a 3.5-year relationship with physical violence, emotional violence, even sexual violence, but either or both of those partners may or may not believe that is a traumatic experience for him or herself, correct?
Yes, sir. People mistake the stimulus about what happens as the trauma. The trauma is really the reaction to it. So bad things that happen, people don't always react in the same way to them. So yes, sir, that's correct.
So for instance, a homicide detective or a homicide prosecutor may go out to a scene and see a freshly dead body, and their perception of that environmental stimulus may be very different from somebody who
They did,
works
yes.
at Dunkin' Donuts and just gives us muffins in the morning coming across a dead body. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
But we're not, we're trying to, there's nothing we can do about George now. Yes, I agree with you, but he also did the same with her. I'm just looking at this as from a legal perspective of what they need to establish and prove to meet this battered wife syndrome criteria. And yeah, they're pretty much, because at the end of the day, you think about it, Elizabeth, have they met their burden? Do you believe beyond a reasonable doubt that she committed second-degree murder by the legal standards, because they have proved intent, they have proved a depraved mind, and a willful disregard for human life? Now, with all this testimony and all this evidence, there is no doubt in your mind that that's exactly what happened here. That's where we're going. That's what we've got to get to.
That homicide detective may be able to go eat lunch right after it, and the other person who works at the donut restaurant may not be able to eat for a couple of days as a result. So yes, perception is a big part of how trauma occurs.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand your answers today, and I'm not saying that they were different the other day, but I understand you to say that it's very important to do a comprehensive evaluation to get the full picture of what is going on in the perceived battered spouse mind, correct?
Yes.
So he hasn't assessed Sarah. He is just providing his expert opinion on what the definition of battered spouse is, what normally appears, presents, occurs, needs to happen, what it is, what's it's about, what to look for, and all the other components that go along with that. She's pretty much ticked every box, apart from the actual diagnosis, which they will get. They've got, I think, 3 psychiatrists on the list. Hang on. They have Dr. Edward Wiley, forensic pathologist, Charles Heller, which is a domestic violence psychologist, I'm sure she's got a psychiatrist in there as well. Oh, Julie Harper, yeah. So they've got another 3 at least experts to testify. She's contradicted herself yesterday because she said that she zipped the suitcase up all the way after forcing his hand back in, and then she said that she'd unzipped it enough for him to go out before. Yes, yeah, going upstairs. And I agree. Yeah, I agree. But that is going to
Objection is
be
overruled.
irrelevant when the jury goes back there, because
So we've been
her
talking about the
perception is
importance of
altered.
doing a comprehensive evaluation with as many collateral sources as one could possibly have when making an assessment about the battered spouse syndrome, correct?
Yes, sir. Relevant piece of information. Yes, sir.
And would you agree that obviously the person who is
They're going to argue that her perception is altered with this, and she's in a heightened state of fear because of this. So she's not responding properly. She has the alcohol on board, so her cognitive decisions are not reasonable, and it's going to be irrelevant how far that was zipped up or not, because it's her perception of the perceived threat to harm.
Is accused of committing a crime, there are credibility issues that you do need to care for when relying upon that person's history provided about the events leading to that and the past events describing the relationship with the intimate partner.
Yes, sir. In every forensic evaluation, that's the case.
Is this particularly important if there's a comorbidity with an alcohol abuse disorder?
Yes.
And can you tell the jury what alcohol abuse disorder means in the DSM-5 TR?
Sure. It's the biggest part of it is it's not just the use of alcohol, it's impairment that happens as a result. So it's the excessive use of alcohol, but that could mean something different, just like the excessive use of marijuana might mean. But it's the use of alcohol to the degree that it impairs or affects a person's life. And with that may come a lot of other things like deceitfulness or aggression or unreliability, sleep or somatic problems, difficulties. So, but the important thing to remember there is that it's the use of a substance that impairs or affects a person's life.
And if there is alcohol involved in the histories being given about either the event in question or any preceding events, must the evaluator take that into account when evaluating the memories and perceptions of the person giving them that history?
Yes. So in introducing that new topic about memory, we know that substances can interfere and impair memory. So as a result of that, you'd want to know what they were using, how close it was. If you're talking about a particular event, like a crime, you'd want to know if there was substance usage, and if so, what the person's memory functioning was, and does that match up with other sources of information about what those events were.
Are you familiar with the narcissistic personality disorder?
Yes, sir, of course.
Is that something recognized in the DSM-5 TR?
Yes, sir.
And can you tell us whether or not if a person who is giving a history, whether it's the patient/client or whatnot, has traits, perhaps not a diagnosis, but even just traits of the narcissistic personality disorder?
Doesn't matter.
Is that something the evaluator should account for in evaluating the credibility of the history?
I'll show you in a second.
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, because all forms of disorders or conditions or just traits may lead to inaccurate information, either not purposely or purposely. They may be deceptive. So certain personality disorders or traits can lead to deception or inappropriate or inaccurate information. That's why you need more than one source of information. Does what this is what this person's saying to me check out with other sources of information?
And I don't mean to
Husband?
push you on it, but can you tell us some of the criteria for the narcissistic personality disorder?
I can, yes, sir. So it is a grandiose sense of self-worth. It's the consideration of yourself over anybody else. It's kind of operating in your own world. So it's an inflated sense of who you are. It's a misperception of how important you are.
I excel at everything, but can she have both? Can she have both?
To other people and your meaning to other people. It's a sense of specialness that you stand out from other people in terms of special skill or skills, and that other people, if they don't recognize that, they should recognize that. So the biggest heading there is an inflated sense of self-esteem and grandiosity.
Are you familiar with an adjustment disorder diagnosis?
Yes, sir.
And is that in the DSM-5 TR?
Yes, sir. Correct.
Can you tell us about that?
Adjustment disorder is a person's reaction, and it could be emotional, it can be behavioral, or it can be both, to a situation that occurs. You broke up with your boyfriend or girlfriend, so you're upset about that. And so as a result, you're tearful, you're anxious or nervous or worried about what may happen to you as a result of breaking up with them, or you behaviorally may not going to work, or get into more arguments or fights with your children as a result. So it's a temporary reaction to a stressful situation that occurs in some individuals.
And hypothetically, if a person who is giving a history for criteria of diagnosis, let me strike that. if somebody is giving a history and that is being used to come to an evaluation
Yeah.
conclusion of battered spouse syndrome.
And what does that cause, Elizabeth? Hmm? That's what I mean.
If that person has been diagnosed with adjustment disorder predating the traumatic relationship, is that something the evaluator should take into account?
You'd want to know any prior diagnosis because it may not necessarily be exclusionary, but it could. So adjustment disorder is a temporary reaction. You're upset in a temporary period, and most of them just go away on their own. Whereas something else like a traumatic stress disorder is long-term. It's something that person's stuck with for a period of time that usually doesn't just go away on its own. So yes, you'd want to know that for that term I used before, that differential diagnosis. You'd want to know those things to compare and contrast them and hold them up against each other.
Now, hypothetically, if somebody says things
Yep.
like, I'm the best thing that has ever happened to you, and I'm the best you'll ever do, are those indications of the narcissistic personality disorder?
Well, they could be. You wouldn't want just that alone. You'd want to see if that was happening in other settings. Is that happening on the job, with friends, with family members? Is it showing up on psychological testing? But certainly that would be a red flag. You'd go, I want to pay more attention to that. I want to investigate that further.
And is it important when evaluating trauma-based disorders, because they're based on emotional reactions, to do that rule out on alcohol or drug use?
Certainly you'd want to do that. It's not usually disguised as a trauma-based disorder. Alcohol and trauma aren't usually rule outs for each other, but it could exacerbate a condition. Could make you diagnose a trauma condition when it's just an adjustment disorder. I say just, I don't mean to minimize it, but it's not as serious as a trauma-based disorder.
Is it important to consider whether the abuser and or the abused behave differently in the absence of alcohol or drugs?
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, because you're trying to analyze a psychological condition. If as a result of drug or alcohol abuse, their behavior changes or their perceptions change, that's not a psychological condition, that's a substance abuse disorder. So that's why you'd want to know that. So if their condition remains the same, maybe it's a little worse when they're using drugs or alcohol, but it's the same perception of threat or danger, then you're going to diagnose a trauma-based disorder. If not, then you're going to diagnose a...
By the way, are they going to retry her? After 5 years? Nope.
substance abuse disorder. You can have both, but you'd want to rule one out as opposed to the other.
And are you familiar with the classic three-step cycle of battered spouse syndrome or domestic violence?
Yes, sir.
Can you explain that to the jury?
Sure. So there's a cycle of violence that was first developed by a woman in the 70s called Lenore Walker, Dr. Lenore Walker. She's a psychologist usually.
Hey. All right. Lenore Walker, 1979, described it. There you go. Right there. So it's a cluster of psychological, that includes emotional, cognitive, behavioral deficits. And the cycle is, where is it? Next one, I think. Basically like the build up, the battering itself, and then the reconciliation phase. All three.
Credited with developing the whole theory of battered spouse syndrome. And in the classic model, which we know oftentimes happens, not every time, but in the classic model, there's a period of tension buildup where things are happening, little arguments are happening, there's bickering back and forth, there may be some threats or some loud voices back and forth, but it's all things that are leading up to a possible violent episode. Then there's the episode that happens itself, the violent episode. It could be verbal, sexual, physical, but there's the violent incident that occurs. And then after that violent episode occurs, there's a honeymoon phase where the person who's done the abuse, they're apologizing, taking that person who's abused out to dinner, buying them things, saying nice things to them, complimenting them to sort of make up for the abuse. And it's kind of it's called the cycle of violence. And the reason why is it tends to repeat itself in a lot of these situations of battered spouse syndrome, where you see this repeating itself over and over and over again. So people are kind of stuck in these revolving doors in their relationship.
And can one cycle be enough to traumatize a person?
Yes.
Does this trauma necessarily have to be coming from a man to a woman?
No.
No.
And in fact, as times have changed, language has changed. And so when we keep referring to it as battered woman syndrome in the courtroom today,
Battered.
what we're actually talking about now is
Partner
battered spouse
syndrome.
syndrome or even intimate partner
Mhm.
violence.
Yes, sir. I mean, interpartner violence can happen outside of legal settings, but it's really a kind of the large over grouping, if you will, to be able to talk about all of these other things that can happen as a result, like trauma-based disorders and battered spouse syndrome. And you're right. The later research has kind of pulled us away from thinking this only happens to women in heterosexual relationships. We know now there's all sorts of derivations, and that men can suffer also from battered spouse syndrome, battered person syndrome, homosexual couples. So we know it goes around to everybody, but still, women are more often diagnosed with battered spouse syndrome than anybody else.
Does the trauma have to come in the form of physical violence?
No, sir.
Does it have to come in the form of sexual violence?
No, sir.
Can it come in the form of emotional or mental violence?
Yes, sir.
And would examples of that include such as running the partner down and telling them that they're no good and, just general insulting and lowering their value?
It could. Remember, that's the stimulus, so it would depend on how the person who's receiving that responds to it as to whether or not it becomes traumatic. But yes, sir, that'd be the first red flag you'd want to investigate.
And you mentioned isolation before. So if somebody in a hypothetical intimate partner setting is trying to isolate the partner from his or her family members or friends or coworkers, can that be, and I'm not saying necessarily, can that be indications of intimate partner violence that could lead to battered spouse?
So sure, that'd be an example of coercive control. So if a person was doing that, that's consistent with that classification of battered person syndrome. Yes.
And hypothetically, controlling another person, the intimate partner's personal property or effects, such as a birth certificate or identification papers, can that be indication of emotional trauma towards the partner who is lacking the control over those identification papers?
So that's a stimulus that could result, depending on how the person subjectively perceives it, in some.
Why is the state asking these questions when they're doing nothing but supporting her claim? So what's happened, I think, Elizabeth, is that they've both become intoxicated, and he's put himself in a position where he is vulnerable, and it's not often that she has that opportunity of his vulnerability to address stuff. And now she's got the alcohol on board. She's disinhibited. She's got that gumption to actually say and speak her mind, because she figures he's in this suitcase and he can't hurt me. And that's what she said. The argument ensued, and then he started threatening her, and that's when she starts having the intrusive thoughts. That's when the video is happening, and you can hear her saying, that's for every time you choke me. That's for everything you've done to me. Like that's her perception and hypervigilance to that trauma response. That's where it starts, and that's how it progressed. So it's hard to explain, but that mindset, I guarantee you that she's met the criteria. And the fact that this defense has gotten all of this information, all of these experts, all of these assessments, and all of this packaged up in 45 days. Yeah, she did absolutely took the opportunity over him, but she has, if she can prove this battered wife syndrome, it doesn't matter, because it's her perception of imminent threat or danger. If she perceives it to be that she's in imminent harm and she zips it back up, she is preventing herself from that harm. And I don't know how they can get away from that. Yeah, I don't agree with her behaviour, but as a legal standpoint and the criteria and what they're going to argue and what they need to prove to get to that, it's possible. It's possible. Absolutely possible.
Trauma. So yes, all of the things that you mentioned could be stimulus, if you will, that a person
Mhm.
could perceive as traumatic.
Mhm.
Hypothetically, if one partner A gives partner B a gift, such as a bicycle, but partner A continues to maintain that the bicycle is his or hers because he or she bought it, even though it was a gift to B, can that be a form of emotional abuse towards B?
Sure, it sounds like control, but I guess you could interpret it as emotional abuse too. But it sounds more like a control mechanism that'd be consistent.
I'm not suggesting that it's legally or morally okay, but when one intimate partner does these hypothetical emotional things, non-physical violent things to partner B,
So he's going along
partner
the
B has
same.
poor personal skills and coping.
He's doing exactly what I just said. He's going to reverse it and say that she was doing it to him as well, which absolutely could happen. Absolutely, they could both have it, but that doesn't mean she doesn't. He's not on trial here, unfortunately.
Skills and maybe consuming alcohol. Is it unreasonable or unfathomable to hear that partner B responded?
And that's all you need, that possibility, because that creates doubt, and that's all they need to do.
Yes.
I did this chart up to try and explain how it all connects together. So have a look at that. So now let me take your comment off there. So there on the left there, they're claiming that this is the syndrome that she has, and there are all the components that go with it. Once they have that trigger, or what did they call it? The lost the name of the word of it again. Something act. Him basically threatening to kill her basically was the trigger point that then creates that extreme emotional response. And because of
After
the
hearing
previous
argument of counsel, the
history,
objection is overruled.
So let me respond to that.
we'll go back
If you
to that.
remember the question,
Do.
please go ahead.
So it would increase the probability of physical violence. So if those things, in fact, were perceived as threatening or abusive in any way or
Right.
insulting to the person who they were directed towards, it would increase the probability of physical violence.
And then again, the perceptions are all in the eye of the beholder, whether
Yep.
emotional things that are said to one another or physical things are done to one another, whether the recipient
Doesn't matter, they're not real.
views it as trauma is a subjective decision by that person. Right?
Yes, the perception is the impact. So that's how you would know that. It's just, water off a duck's back, or is it something that kind of sticks with me and I think about it all the time?
Now, you mentioned earlier.
Don't forget, this jury knows nothing about the last 5 years of Sarah and her behaviour and how many attorneys she's been through and what a pain in the ass she's been. They are just seeing the evidence and the facts presented to them in this case. That's it. They know nothing else.
Anxiety, low self-esteem, and depression can all be components of battered spouse syndrome, correct?
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Is it important as the evaluator to rule out whether or not these conditions predated the violent or abusive relationship?
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, because where things start is important diagnostically. So
There's
if
two
all of
contributing
those things
factors.
were in place, all of the symptoms that were just mentioned are in place, then you wouldn't attribute those to the abuse. You'd say those things were pre-existing. Now, abuse could make it worse,
Mm-hmm.
but in terms of your diagnosis, you need to know where things started. So if those symptoms didn't start at the time where there was abuse that was alleged to have occurred, then it's unlikely that it's attributed to that abuse.
All right. Now, put it this way. He's saying that she had depression before she met George. Okay. The one form of domestic violence is financial. That's why they brought in the alimony issue with the ex-husband. They can tie that then to previous relationship with elements of domestic violence. I'm kind of looking at it as if, say, any of the Jews have never been. Yes, they may not understand or get her mindset, whereas if some of them have, but I'm not sure what the questions were asked in Vidya, but there's only 6 of them, remember, and they have to weigh the credibility of these witnesses and the evidence in front of them. And I don't think the state put on a strong case at all. And, the state can say, well, George was a victim of battered spouse syndrome, and he may well be. But at the end of the day, it's irrelevant because he's not on trial. She could still also suffer from the same thing. That's right. And they've seen all of those photos.
Independent of any narcissistic personality disorder traits, would you agree that anybody in a certain...
See, what is shitting me is he's bringing this up now. Why haven't they put on an expert? Why didn't they get her assessed? And, by a psychiatrist for narcissistic personality disorder. The only way they can argue that that may be a contributing factor or that may be the alternative is if they had her assessed for that. You can't just say that she could have that. They haven't done it. Their case is done. And of course, the defense isn't going to put anyone on that says, no, she's a narcissist and doesn't have battered spouse syndrome. They've dropped the ball.
certain legal setting has a motivation to present themselves in a certain way?
Yes, to do impression management, either depending on the outcome. So if there's punitive sanctions, they may lie to make themselves look worse, or as a result, if they're in other settings like divorce settings, they may lie to make themselves look better. So there's always some impression management you have to kind of look through in your evaluation.
And that's important for an evaluation.
All subjective.
It should be looked at in
Where's
every
your evidence?
evaluation.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
You've got no evidence of that
Redirect
whatsoever.
examination.
Just want to, one more time, in response to the state's questioning, you indicated that where
Close the door.
the
It's cold.
individual's credibility may be in question, there is a necessity that the individual who's making the assessment corroborate whatever they're being told. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. In a number of different ways. We have psychological tests that assess for things called malingering or faking mental health problems or difficulties. So you'd want to do that. You'd want to look at other evidence to see if it's all consistent. So it's very important you don't just rely on self-report.
It's possible that an individual may exhibit one or two attributes of a particular DSM diagnosis, but not actually qualify because it's simply not there.
Right. Sure. So sometimes like social isolation can be because we're introverted, or it could be part of depression. So you need to kind of follow it out and see how many of the symptoms are there to see whether or not it meets the criteria.
So I may exhibit one or two symptoms of narcissism, but not qualify because I don't meet all of those, or a significant number of the indicators that you would rely upon to make that diagnosis.
Yes, sir. Or it can be situationally based, like we may display narcissistic features here in a courtroom, but may not do that in any other part of our life.
Now, in your experience, have you learned either through your studies, experience, and so on, whether or not the abusive behavior may begin based upon an individual's perception of things occurring to him as a child or her as a child? In other words, if they grow up in an abusive household,
I understand.
Yep.
Sustained.
even you've indicated that there are things that, I think in response to the state's cross-examination, that there are things that may add to or may contribute to a particular psychosis or symptom. Would an individual's background as a child include those types?
Have you done the poll? Have you voted in the poll? There is a provision for that.
type of criteria?
Yes, sir. You're more vulnerable to certain psychological conditions based on your history. So if you've been traumatized before, or bad situations have happened to you before, if you've suffered from depression before, it makes you more vulnerable to those conditions or other conditions later on.
Finally, one question or one symptom that we haven't discussed, I don't think, or maybe it was discussed by the state, was learned helplessness. What is that?
Learned helplessness, I've really spoken about it a little bit, but now we have the fancy term for it. Learned helplessness was really researched by someone named Seligson, a doctor named Seligson, a psychologist, research psychologist. And just real briefly, what it is, it's when someone kind of gives up and feels like there's nothing that they can do to change their situation. It was originally done with laboratory animals, but where a person really feels that no matter what strategy they've taken, like leave, stay, fight, whatever it might be, it won't work. It usually leads to depression or developments of other strategies, like I have to appease or please or make sure I do everything correctly or apologize. So it's really believing that no matter what you do, it won't be effective.
Doctor, thank you for your testimony. Thank you for
Sure.
traveling up here from Miami so early in the morning.
No problem at all.
Thank you, sir. You can be excused.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Get the praise approach for a moment.
Awesome.